What's going on, Center City Church?
You already know.
I like that. You guys kind of both pointed.
Yeah, well, I saw Rachel doing it, and I was like, maybe I should point.
Favorite and sing song, go.
Hold on. It's coming. I can see Justin Timberlake's spaghetti hair.
Does he look like a puppet?
Yeah. But you kept on singing Britney Spears, and now all I can sing is Britney Spears.
Okay.
Oh, baby, bye, bye, bye. That's like...
There was a song on that album called This I Promise You that in 8th grade I was sure that when I got married, that was the song that I was going to dance to for my first dance at my wedding, which thankfully I've been single long enough that is no longer my plan.
Oh, no, we are holding your feet to that
we
fire.
believe in transformation
You know
and
what, guys?
restoration
We
in this
believe
church.
that your
Thank you,
8th grade
Rachel.
self
I'm going to listen
needs
to
to
the
be
intern.
represented.
It's time to rename something.
So, Rachel, I'm so glad you're here on the podcast with us
It's
today.
good to be here.
And you preached for us yesterday. How did that feel?
Yeah, that was the thing. It was really cool. I was excited and nervous, and then I just came up here and I feel like I blacked out. So it was a good time, though.
I guess that's good. For those of you who don't know Rachel, she's been interning with us since the fall, so almost the whole school year. And you've been doing a phenomenal job. She does a lot with small groups. You see her all the time. She makes coffee. She leads worship. She's just awesome. And you're a great preacher, too. It was so good to hear from you yesterday. Now, one more question that might have been the cause of your blackout before we get into the content. How did it feel to have to co-preach with your homiletics professor?
My pastor, my mentor, my professor. You know what? You didn't see it, but backstage, I kind of was freaking out. And I was just fine. I was like, man, he's good. And I have to go up after this? I was like... But then it was just like, it just felt natural. It was probably one of the better experiences that I've had with group preaching. So it was awesome.
You did great. And I actually felt bad. I walked off the stage, and we did this thing where I kind of came up in the middle and preached a little bit more, and then you finished off. And I was like, man, most people would have had a really hard time with the rhythm of that, but you did a great job with the rhythm of that. And then just for future notice, I probably won't do that again. So you did so good, though. It really, you could just tell that we were hearing from the gut, like we were hearing from what the Lord had revealed to you in your quiet time, in your preparation, and it was amazing. So well done.
Thank you, guys.
Yeah.
So kind.
And so just for people to jog their memories, because by Wednesday sometimes it's hard to remember, will you give a really kind of brief overview of what you guys were talking about in the message on Sunday?
Yeah, so we were walking through Genesis 28, and we have Abraham, Isaac, and now we're finally meeting with Jacob. And Jacob, he goes on, he fled his brother Esau and his home, and he takes a big rock and he goes to bed, and he gets this dream, and he sees these angels ascending and descending a stairway to heaven, and he wakes up, and it's basically this passage breaking down how he processes how to react to God giving him the covenant that was given to his father and his grandfather. And so we walk through, okay, you're in the presence of God. How do you respond to the presence of God? Jacob literally says, the Lord is here, and I wasn't even aware of it. And so you see him now processing in the steps that he takes in response to the Spirit, if you kind of want to break that down, or...
Yeah, we can just
to
start
go,
diving in. That was a great overview. And the only reason that I'm not singing Stairway to Heaven right now is because I don't want YouTube to give us a copyright thing. But thank you for using that phrase. Now the song is in my head. But you said something that I hadn't thought about until right in this moment, which I'm very sorry. This is what I do. I just ask questions as they pop into my head.
I'm in the hot seat. Let's go.
But this idea of Jacob realizing that God was with him and saying that he hadn't even realized it. And this is totally putting people on the spot, including myself, but I'm curious if you've had a time in your life where you realized kind of in the middle of a situation or had just a sudden awareness that God was with you when you hadn't felt his presence up to this point. Simple question.
Yeah. What's actually crazy is today.
Oh,
yeah.
Well, there you go.
So this has really been real life, this passage in Genesis. I have just felt, you can even preach, you can be involved in church, but it really takes your personal commitment to Christ in your relationship. And, post-Sunday blues are real, and then Monday you're waking up, you're going to class, and then I kind of just sat at home and I just felt distant for some reason. And then I went to go do something and I just stopped and I was like, no, God is literally right here.
Yeah.
And all I have to do is actually be the one to recognize it and reach out and be like, all I have to do is just open the word or stop and just start talking. And automatically, because I have that relationship, he meets me there and I feel the presence. So I think a lot of times we're like, oh, I have to be in a church service or I have to be in this spiritual mountaintop to really feel God and know that he's there. But in all reality, it's just like, stop and just talk to him like you've always known how to talk to him. And he really will like meet you there. So
Yeah.
it was just today. So
That's
yeah.
cool. It reminds me of what you talked about the presence of God always being with us. And I think of you all the time because you say this a lot and you should say it a lot, but how the only time his position towards us changes is when he moves closer to the brokenhearted.
Yeah.
Did you want to share your own story or talk a little more about that?
Well, I just think sometimes we got to allow our theology, well, I think always, we need to allow our theology to affect our emotion. We also need to allow our theology to affect our behavior. And I think sometimes we have that backwards. So I say that because when we think of experience with God, we often kind of instantly go to, there was one time where I felt, and we use that terminology a lot, right? So then what we're saying in our theology is there's times where I don't feel God, and if I don't, quote unquote, feel God, then I'm not in his presence. Well, the difference between me and Jacob is that Jacob was living under a different kind of relationship and structure with God, whereas when Jesus comes, like he is quick to let us know, I'm changing this all. And now the covenant, which was, we didn't really spend a lot of time on the image of the stairway to heaven, but the reason why even that imaging doesn't necessarily apply anymore is because the Savior has come down, right? He has come down the stairs. And now my theology says that he is always close. Now it's just a matter of when my perspective changes. In those moments where I haven't been considerate, where I haven't considered his proximity, where my eyes are open to the idea, like you said, which, so eloquently in your story this morning, oh, I remembered that. Now it's not what I feel, it's what I remembered, because my theology dictates the way I behave, and the way that I behave dictates the way I feel. So I think it's a really critical distinction between Jacob and where we are today. And one of the important nuances of that passage is this idea that the presence of God is consistently close.
Yeah, and not to say that it's wrong to feel that and celebrate when you do, but in those times when you don't, you can trust what you know.
So I think it's a superpower that we're missing out on, right? Like in every superhero journey, there's that place where they discovered their power and they have to figure out how to like flip the switch. I do think that as believers, it's one of the tools that we have in our arsenal that in the middle of some of the toughest times and circumstances, we can allow our theology to remind us that he's close, and it dictates the way that we behave and the way that we feel. And we really can, again, train ourselves to consider the proximity of God.
Yeah, I love it. So, and that's kind of what you guys spent most of the time on Sunday was what happens when you've had an encounter with the presence of God. How do we respond? And the first thing that you said was worship. This is like my pop quiz. Was I paying attention? And I love how you talked about worship, Rachel, and was thinking through, because what Jacob did was he made a pillar, which I really like wordplay, and you didn't do a pillar joke, but it's okay. I forgive you. John, don't worry. I've got another one for you coming up.
You and your
Just get ready for when I preach. But he made this pillar of remembrance, and I think sometimes we can get so bogged down on how like official that sounds, and like, well, what am I supposed to go out in my yard and like stack some rocks up, which some of my neighbors have totally done, and it looks cool. Or like how do I respond in those moments so that I can't make a pillar, but I still want there to be some sign of remembrance that other people can come to and see that like this is where the living God is. What would you say to someone who's not Jacob, traveling as like a nomadic herder?
Yeah, well, first of all, I definitely wouldn't recommend using a rock as a pillow. So that would be like the first step towards modernity. No, but I think personally, I'm a big journaler, writing down the moment, and I've blown through lots of notebooks, but then I can go back. I have a place where they're stored, and I can go back and see all the answered prayers, see all the times that I've gotten a word. And that's almost like a personal altar, a personal pillar. But you're talking about a place where people can come in and see.
Yeah, because you talked about how in Genesis people came back to that place over and over.
I think I have roommates, and so that's a little bit different too. I always just keep my Bible out. And when that Bible's out, we almost have more discussions about the word, or they see me reading, oh, I'm sorry, but like, okay, the atmosphere is set. But even to go a little bit deeper in that, you've had a personal moment. You want to make that altar moment. I just see what's around me. I make note of it. And then every time I see that, it's almost like it triggers that memory. So there was one time I was having a really hard time writing a sermon, and I was just pacing back and forth in the parking lot of a church that I live nearby. Now, every time I see that parking lot, I remember that prayer, remember that place. And so I think visuals can really help you remember and trigger those moments that you've had with the Lord.
Yeah, that's awesome.
But it's tricky because that's very personal.
Right. Yeah, you look like you have a thought.
I mean, I have a couple thoughts. I think that technically we become the living altar, right? Like we become the physical representation of the goodness of God. Yeah. I do think there's some practicals too for those people who are into different art forms or different hobbies. If you're a writer, blogging some of these experiences. I actually enjoy being behind the camera and editing a little bit. So I've been editing these stories, and whatever that looks like, whether that's pushing them out to social media or keeping them, for me, one of the things that I love doing is, on my Apple TV, there's this feature where it'll just pop up videos, and there's times where I'll share those videos to people who I know kind of might need the story of my boys or the story of a struggle that I went through, and this picture, sometimes pictures work. So I think there's some practical applications to that too, but ultimately I think we are that living remembrance of the goodness of God.
Yeah, isn't there's somewhere, maybe one of the Peters, this is I'm not going to remember the exact place where it talks about us being the living temple.
Yeah, absolutely.
So yeah, I love that. Well, John, I have a beef with you too, because you talked about renaming your situation. He knows what's coming, guys. And so the place where Jacob was when this happened was called Luz, and I don't understand why you didn't talk about how if he hadn't renamed his situation, he would be a loser.
It's spelled L-U-Z, by the way, loser.
Guys,
so that's
I'm
pretty
sorry. I don't know what's gotten into me.
Well, that's why I didn't do it, because I figured you would pass out.
I would just start celebrating.
Utter excitement.
So jokes aside,
now people
are going to remember.
Aren't you glad to know what doesn't make it to the pulpit on a Sunday? This is good stuff.
So jokes aside, it would have helped people remember.
Yes.
But you did talk about the importance of renaming the situation, that when he woke up, nothing was the same. Even though nothing had physically changed, he was still in the exact same place, but he gave it a new name. Will you talk just a little bit about what that looks like for us to reframe our circumstances when we may have a moment where we do feel the Lord, we may not, we may just hold on to what we know, but still we wake up and nothing has actually changed. Jacob's still fleeing his brother, still sleeping on a stone.
And yet everything changed. And I think that's the issue for a lot of us. We struggle with perspective. Mm-hmm. We have a tendency of glorifying the need. We have a tendency of glorifying the struggle. Sometimes we do it because it's our nature. Sometimes we do it because it kind of helps feed the woe is me. And again, it's not that Jacob's circumstance wasn't real. It's not that people's circumstance isn't real, but the moment he had this experience and encounter with the Lord, for Jacob, it was a total transformation of perspective. So technically, although nothing changed, everything changes. And I think as believers, where we miss out is where when we tend to get stuck, which I believe is a very cultural mentality right now, because everybody approaches things from their brokenness. Now, again, it's not to belittle people's brokenness, but to consider that Jacob in a moment, because had an experience with God, and his brokenness is now renamed in a way that really becomes this expression of the goodness and faithfulness of God, not just for Jacob, but for generations to come. We're still thousands of years later preaching about Jacob and this moment. legitimately everything changed for him, although nothing seemed to change. I really do think that renaming allows us to refocus, re-examine, reimagine what God can be doing in this moment. And again, what would have been intended as boundaries and what have been intended as limitations can now become platforms and motivations that God can then use to take you into the next season. But you can't be afraid to rename stuff. I think that this becomes a conversation about vocabulary, and that whole idea of taming your tongue, and the idea of power of life and death is in the tongue. And Scripture speaks a lot about this one muscle that kind of controls the direction of our lives. And I'm really careful now, because there's this big kind of movement towards, well, just say everything and somehow that's magically, no. What Jacob was saying was aligned perfectly with the will and the thoughts of God. So I'm not telling you to make stuff up.
Yeah.
I'm telling you to consider that what God is doing in this season is bigger than what you're currently naming it as. You need to learn how to live in the faith of what God is doing in the season versus kind of what you see around you.
And I would say, just real talk for a second. You talked about the tongue, but sometimes we're not even speaking. It's the narrative that we're
Absolutely.
telling ourselves over and over again that really needs to be renamed before we ever open our mouth and say something to anyone else. At least that's where I fight the battle.
And a good weapon for that is your actual physical tongue. Like speaking out loud those things you know to be true, right? Regardless of what you're feeling or thinking in your head, huge. I mean, again, I know I'm the guy that always kind of comes back to practicalities, but I was reading about somebody who every morning his alarm goes off and he names his alarm by these thoughts of just these strong words of affirmation. Now, again, he's not a believer, but for me, I just thought of an example. Like, what would it look like that every time you look at your phone in the morning, it's a reminder of the goodness of God, of what he's called you, and how's he called you to be, and what the passages are. Like, it doesn't have to be long and elaborate, but just those moments where I'm speaking out of my mouth and I'm seeing with my eyes, being reminded constantly of the goodness of God and how he's formed me, really can begin to change the way I think of myself.
I don't know how we ended up here, but I actually have reminders from Psalm 139
Absolutely.
that go off at 7 a.m., noon, 7 p.m., and 10 p.m., just as like every single day for me to look at and then pray to the Lord, and it does really help.
Absolutely. It's a language, words, you know this of me, like this is the part of my life that I feel like the Lord has over and over reminded me of how important everything that comes out of our mouth is. And everything that's already come out of his mouth that's been written down for us. Those two things together can motivate and direct our lives in the way that I believe he's called us to live.
Yeah, I love this. I wish we could talk forever, but we can't. And I do want to just briefly talk about where we're going, because we're starting a brand new series.
Woohoo!
And it's going to be awesome.
It's amazing.
Do you want to say a little bit about it?
Yeah. So we begin kind of our march to Easter.
March. John can pun
Wow.
too. Language matters, John.
It does. You know when you start hanging out with your dog a lot and you start looking like your dog and your dog starts looking at you? I'm the dog in this analogy, Ashley. That's not
was like,
what's going
who's the
on. I'm the dog. I'm starting to kind of regurgitate these things naturally. It's kind of scary.
So Easter.
Easter.
Thanks, Rachel.
Thank you. So Easter's right around the corner, and we've just been enamored as we've considered all these stories in the New Testament of how Jesus, in a moment, brings life in the middle of death. I love that picture. Matter of fact, even the way that the New Testament writes, "Oh, death, where is your sting?" It's this picture that as believers, death isn't even something that we should fear, in that he's already conquered death, but it's such a hilarious victory that we can, the word, this is probably strong, and I don't mean it to be this strong, but that idea that the writer is taunting death. He's like, I'm not even concerned. And then I don't want to preach this all, but then the response is just simply, because to live is Christ and to die is gain. Like, if there's another moment, it's going to be scripted by the person of who Jesus is. And if there's not another, I'll be sitting in his presence, worshiping the guy who is scripted every moment. I'm good. Either way, death has no sting. And just, I think it's a timely word for where we're living today. How many people do you know are walking around kind of dancing with death? It's just this constant dance partner that we've allowed to kind of set and dictate our emotional condition, our mental health, our relationships, our financial strategies, like all of them have this stench of death. And I'm just believing that God's going to wake some people up, and I'm excited about it. I cannot wait. And we start this week.
We start this week?
Let's go.
Yeah, we're so excited. So Death to Life starts this week, and we'll march all the way through to Easter. One thing to already know about is Good Friday.
Yeah.
We will be having a service in person at 7 p.m. So go ahead, and as you're making your plans for Easter, keep in mind that we'll be here and would love for you to join us. We'd also love for you to bring someone, not just to Good Friday, but to any of these, because all of us are struggling with this, and if you're not struggling with it directly, you know someone who is, and what better time to bring someone than when we're talking about the power of Jesus to raise death to life.
Yes, come on.
That's awesome. So we'll see you on Sunday. Have a great week.